Good morning. My name is Faye Halls. My ancestral name is Yeltsilewet. I come from the Baker and the Rivers family. My late father was Chief Simon Baker, Katlacha Siam. He was raised on the Hamoshesan village, which is where the Lionsgate Bridge is right now. But I'd like to go back a bit further in time to have you understand what 150 years ago was like in our village. My dad's father was born in one of the villages in Stanley Park, right across from Cole Harbor. And my dad's grandfather actually jumped off one of the British ships when it came into port and stayed with a woman he was in love with. And so my grandfather was born there. My dad was born in 1911, and his mom could not look after all the children she had, so she sent my dad down to live with Mary Capilano and Chief Joe Mathias. Mary Capilano was my dad's grandmother, and she always took in children. It was the way things were in our villages. If people couldn't feed their family, then they would shift them to aunts, uncles, grandmas, grandpas. So my dad and two brothers were sent to live with Mary Capilano and her family on the waterfront across from what we know as Prospect Point right now. There were no bridges, there were no industry, there was no dam. The tide would go way out and the beach would be abundant with clams, oysters, any kind of seafood you could ask for. Our villages, the women always had their own canoes, the men had their own canoes. And so Mary Capilano would go out with her children and they would collect clams when the tide was out. And Dad remembers very clearly you could almost walk to Prospect Point. It would go out so far. Then they would fill these baskets, handmade by Mary Capilano, with clams, seafood, and bring them back to shore and load them in her canoe. They would wait until the tide was up, the highest point. Then my dad would go with his grandma, Ta'a, he called her. And they would go in the canoe, and he said they always went the same way, directly across, and then stayed close to shore next to what we know as Lumberman's Arch now. And they would paddle all the way to the bottom of Granville Street. And my dad would be like 4 or 5 years old. And he remembers clearly the killer whales were always around the canoe. And my ta'a would sing, and the whales would come by. It was like they were her pets. He said they always followed the boat. They would then go to the bottom of Granville Street. There was a dock there, and they always saved a spot for her canoe because they knew she would be coming. Some of the top chefs in Vancouver would be there waiting for her to collect those clams because they knew how fresh they were. And the baskets would become an exchange. There was no value in the basket. This one is actually broken, but they had handles. The chefs would take the baskets full of clams, pay her, I don't know how much they did, or do a trade for flour or food. And then the next morning, they would come back with an empty basket and take a full basket away. So, but then some of the wealthy people in Granville Street started buying, and some of them kept the baskets. And that's how this one ended up being returned to us. So this was a daily routine for the family. And I remember him saying, sometimes we'd have crab for breakfast. There was so much food and berries and fruit trees. He said they never went hungry. It didn't matter. And it was a very satisfying life. His grandma would tell stories. They'd sit by the water and sing. And it was hard to believe that this was 1911. He was born, so this would be about 1915, 16, which is not a long time ago. There were no houses in West Vancouver except cabins on the waterfront. And there was no dam, so the river was totally different. It had tributaries going here and there, and Grandma Capilano used to go up there in her canoe and collect bulrushes to do weaving and things like that. And all of our villages were on a tributary of a river, in the Mosquito Creek River, all the way up to Indian Arm. And everybody traveled by canoe. And it was a very, very peaceful, happy existence. And then things changed, and not for the good.